also brings up a whole other risk to injecting peptides, which is that even if the product you want works, you might not be getting that product, or at least not exactly. Right, for example, in one preprint study from this year, researchers looked at publicly available data for 14 peptides from a third-party testing platform. What you had them finding was that out of these 6,000 samples from 203 companies, more than 40% failed to meet even basic purity and dose standards. With the UC Davis biologist explaining, research-grade peptides are going to have junk in them. They're going to have chemicals used in the purification process and fragments of peptides that you don't want. And with all that, over the past years, the FDA has actually been trying to crack down on the space, at least somewhat. You've had them sending warning letters to businesses promoting peptides with immune boosting powers. And in 2023, the agency added nearly 20 peptides, including BCP-157, to a list of substances compounding pharmacies are barred from making. But still, despite that, it's believed that most of the injectable peptides sold in the US today, they're produced in them. And if you're not familiar, they're these specialized facilities that can normally only make tailored versions of drugs for individual patients that aren't available from drug manufacturers. These places exist, at least in theory, so that people who can't swallow pills or who need unique doses of their meds or something, they can get the treatment that they need. But also a huge thing is that they're not regulated by the FDA, and so you have some saying they are more likely to make mistakes. So you have people pointing to things like in 2012, for example, a compounding pharmacy in Massachusetts shipped out meds that hadn't been stored properly, and 64 people ended up dead, 750 got sick, and some had new medical issues that never went away. The FDA, they couldn't take any action since compounding pharmacies do not fall under their authority. So that makes them very, very appealing to companies who want to sell a product that lacks evidence. And so with that, during the COVID pandemic, many people got unproven treatments like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin from compounding pharmacies. And now they may also be the loophole that allows the already multi-billion-dollar peptide industry to really blow up. And it's important to note that the way we got here is that in special situations, namely when there's a shortage of a drug that is mass-produced, compounding pharmacies can get permission to make it as well. That's what you saw happen in 2022 with the GLP-1s, for which, like I mentioned earlier, they are peptides, and they've also become so massively popular over the past few years. So also, in 2025, the FDA determined that the shortage of GLP-1s, it had ended, meaning that compounders were expected to halt production. But many have also just continued making custom versions of the drugs anyway. And then also, some of the industry's new production capacity went into producing unproved peptides like BPC-157. And so with that, you had Nathaniel Lackman, a lawyer who specializes in FDA-related issues, saying that until now, there had never been the monetary incentive to push the envelope of what is legally permissible with compounding before. The dollars weren't there. But now, the dollars definitely are, and so may be the political will. Because our resident roadkill lover, RFK, he has long vowed to end what he called the FDA's war on peptides. And his friends and associates, they're among their biggest proponents, including, for example, self-described biohacker and longevity expert Gary Brecka, where he has millions of followers on social media, and he sells peptide injectables, patches, and nasal sprays through his website for $350 to $600 each. And that includes some that the FDA has flagged for serious safety risks. And while if you read the labels, they're only for research, soon you might even have to bother with that whole charade, at least for some of the products. Because back in February, you had RFK appearing on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he was asked about when he'd like to make moves on peptides, and he said this.
I'm a big fan of peptides. I've used them myself and used them with really good effect.
With him then claiming that the FDA's decision under Biden to bar compounding pharmacies from making certain peptides was illegal. And then just a couple of months later, rather than trying to improve access to peptides by calling for more research to prove their safety and effectiveness and then make them available to patients, the FDA, they just began the process of removing many of the regulatory barriers that keep peptides from being legally made by compounding pharmacies. And you had it specifically proposing that several be moved out of the significant safety risk category and into one that would allow compounding pharmacies to legally make them without backing. And actually sometimes even without an inspection. It also removed a number of experts from the so-called compounding advisory panel, and then 6 of the 8 people chosen to replace them, they're people who sell or otherwise have a stake in the peptides industry, while some of the others, besides hawking peptides, you have them running clinics that offer unproven treatments like ozone therapy and energy healing.